Livia was born into Rome's most elite patrician family, thinking she would enjoy unlimited wealth, power, and freedom in the world's greatest empire. What she didn't know was that patrician women were sold into political marriages at age 12, required to submit to their husband's sexual demands regardless of their own desires, and forbidden from owning property, making decisions, or even leaving the house without male permission. Because in ancient Rome, being born into privilege as a woman meant being a beautiful prisoner in a golden cage. Welcome to Whisper of History. Before we begin this incredible story of Livia, whose birth into Rome's highest nobility taught her that wealth and status meant nothing when you were born female in the ancient world, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe that true freedom can never be bought with gold or status. Hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us remember those who lived in cages made of silk and marble. Livia Claudia Pulchra was born on a warm spring morning in 45 BCE in one of the most magnificent villas on the Palatine Hill, the exclusive district where Rome's most powerful families built their palaces overlooking the Eternal City. The Villa of the Claudii was a marvel of marble and gold, its gardens filled with exotic plants from across the empire, its walls decorated with frescoes depicting the family's glorious military victories and political triumphs. From the moment she drew her first breath, Livia was surrounded by luxury that most Romans could never imagine. Slaves attended to her every need, feeding her honey mixed with wine from silver spoons, dressing her in silk imported from distant China, and carrying her through rooms filled with treasures looted from conquered nations. Her nursery was larger than most Roman homes, decorated with ivory statues and furnished with couches carved from rare woods. But even as a child, Livia began to notice the strange contradictions of her privileged existence. Despite living in a palace, she was rarely allowed to leave it. Despite being surrounded by servants, she was never truly alone. Every movement was watched, every word monitored, every friendship evaluated for its political implications. Despite being born into one of Rome's most powerful families, she quickly learned that she herself had no power at all. Her education began early, but it was carefully limited. While her older brother Marcus learned rhetoric, philosophy, military strategy, and law, subjects that would prepare him to lead armies and govern provinces, Livia was taught to embroider, play the lyre, and speak just enough Greek to impress future husbands at dinner parties. When she asked why she couldn't study the same subjects as Marcus, her tutor, an elderly Greek slave named Philippos, looked uncomfortable. "Young mistress," he said carefully, "women's minds are different. Too much learning makes them unsuitable for their natural roles as wives and mothers. Your father has arranged the perfect education to make you attractive to the right kind of husband." The concept of the right kind of husband was a constant presence in Livia's childhood, though she didn't understand its full implications until much later. Even before she reached her 10th birthday, visitors to the villa would study her with calculating eyes, evaluating her developing beauty, commenting on her potential for producing strong children, discussing her value in cementing political alliances between powerful families. "She has good hips," she once overheard a senator's wife saying to her mother. "She'll be able to bear many sons. And that hair, such a lovely shade of gold. Very appealing to men of taste." Livia learned to hate these conversations, but she also learned that expressing her hatred was dangerous. The one time she spoke up, declaring that she didn't want to be evaluated like a piece of breeding livestock, her father's response was swift and painful. The beating was administered by slaves under his direct supervision, and the lesson was clear. Her opinions about her own future were not just unwelcome, they were irrelevant. "You will learn to be grateful for the advantages of your birth," her father, Gaius Claudius Pulcher, told her as she knelt on the marble floor of his study, her back still stinging from the whip. Other women pray to the gods for the opportunities that your beauty and family name will provide. You will not shame us with ungrateful complaints. As she grew older, the restrictions on her freedom became more elaborate and comprehensive. She could not leave the villa without a formal escort of armed guards and female slaves. She could not speak to men outside her immediate family without a chaperone present. She could not read books that had not been approved by her father, could not attend public events without permission, could not even walk in the family gardens without being observed by guards who reported her activities to the household steward. The villa that had seemed like a paradise during her early childhood began to feel more like an elegant prison. The marble walls that had once impressed her with their beauty now seemed like barriers, keeping her trapped inside. The gardens that had been her playground became exercise yards where she was allowed to walk for precisely 1 hour each day, always under supervision, always following the same predetermined paths. But perhaps the most suffocating aspect of her gilded captivity was the constant awareness that her entire existence was temporary. Every luxury she enjoyed, every comfort she was given, every moment of relative freedom was conditional upon her value as a future bride. She was being raised like a prize heifer, pampered and protected only until the moment when she could be sold to the highest bidder in the marriage market that dominated Roman high society. The realization that her childhood was actually an elaborate preparation for ownership by a stranger was perhaps the most devastating discovery of Livia's young life. But it was only the beginning of her education in the realities of being a woman in ancient Rome, no matter how high her social status. As Livia approached her 12th birthday, the pace of marriage negotiations intensified dramatically. The family dining room, where she had once enjoyed relatively peaceful meals with her parents and brother, became a staging ground for elaborate dinner parties designed to showcase her to potential suitors and their families. These events were carefully choreographed performances where every aspect of her appearance and behavior was calculated to maximize her attractiveness as a political and economic asset. The preparation for each dinner party began hours in advance. Slave women would spend the entire day arranging her hair in the latest fashions, applying cosmetics made from lead and mercury that made her skin appear fashionably pale, and dressing her in an increasingly sophisticated stolas that emphasized her developing figure while maintaining the appearance of modesty that Roman men demanded in their wives. Remember, her mother, Claudia Marcella, would instruct her before each performance. You must be charming but not forward, intelligent but not opinionated, beautiful but not vain. You must make each man feel that you would be honored to bear his children while never appearing eager or desperate. It is a delicate balance, but one that every successful patrician wife must master. The dinners themselves were exercises in humiliation disguised as social gatherings. Livia would be seated between potential suitors who evaluated her like livestock buyers examining a prize mare. They would ask her to demonstrate her musical skills, test her knowledge of household management, and engage her in conversations designed to reveal her personality and temperament. Throughout these interactions, she was expected to smile, to defer to their opinions, and to make herself as appealing as possible to men she often found repulsive. "Tell me, child," Senator Lucius Crassus asked during one particularly memorable dinner, his wine-stained breath hot against her ear as he leaned uncomfortably close, "what do you know about managing household slaves? A senator's wife must know how to maintain discipline among the servants, especially the prettier female ones who might tempt her husband." The question was loaded with implications that Livia was only beginning to understand. She had already learned that Roman marriages, especially among the elite, were not exclusive partnerships. Men of her social class routinely took slave mistresses, visited professional prostitutes, and engaged in affairs with other men's wives. A patrician wife was expected not only to tolerate these arrangements, but to manage the household slaves who might become her husband's sexual partners. "I have been well trained in household management, Senator," she replied with the diplomatic vagueness she had been taught to employ in such situations. "I understand that a wife's primary duty is to ensure her husband's comfort and happiness in all things." The answer seemed to satisfy Crassus, who nodded approvingly and made a note on the wax tablet he carried. Like all potential suitors, he was keeping detailed records of her responses, evaluating her suitability not just as a wife, but as a business partner in the complex political and economic relationships that defined Roman high society. But the most disturbing aspect of these matrimonial additions was the clinical nature of the physical evaluations. Under the supervision of their mothers, potential suitors would examine Livia's hands for signs of manual labor, check her teeth for evidence of good health, and observe her posture and movement for indications of her likely fertility. Some families even insisted on consultations with physicians who would examine her more intimately to confirm her virginity and assess her potential for childbearing. "The girl seems healthy," she overheard one doctor reporting to her father after a particularly invasive examination. "Her hips are well formed for childbirth, and there are no signs of disease or deformity. I would estimate she could safely bear 6 to 8 children if properly managed during her pregnancies." The reduction of her entire identity to breeding potential was devastating, but Livia was learning that this was simply the reality of aristocratic Roman marriage. Women of her class were not individuals with their own desires and ambitions. They were reproductive assets whose value was measured by their ability to produce legitimate male heirs for their husbands' families. The negotiations for her marriage were conducted entirely without her input. Her father and potential suitors discussed dowries, political alliances, property transfers, and inheritance rights as if she were a piece of valuable real estate being sold to the highest bidder. Her own preferences about whom she might want to marry were never asked and would not have been relevant if they had been. "The Antonius family has made an excellent offer," her father announced during one family dinner. "Young Marcus Antonius is 28, experienced in military matters, and heir to substantial properties in Gaul. The political alliance would be beneficial to our family's interests in the Senate, and his mother assures me that he is gentle with women and likely to treat you well." The casual mention of being treated well by her future husband revealed another uncomfortable truth about Roman marriage. Physical and sexual abuse of wives was so common that the promise of gentle treatment was considered a significant selling point. Livia had already heard whispered stories from other women about husbands who beat their wives for minor infractions, who forced themselves on unwilling partners, who treated their spouse as nothing more than domestic servants with reproductive obligations. By the time her engagement was formally announced, Livia had come to understand that her wedding day would not be a celebration of love or the beginning of a partnership. It would be the day when ownership of her body, her property, and her future would be transferred from her father to a stranger who would have absolute legal authority over every aspect of her existence. She was 12 years old, and her childhood was officially over. The betrothal ceremony that sealed Livia's fate took place on a crisp October morning in the atrium of her family's villa, surrounded by marble statues of her ancestors and witnessed by some of the most powerful men in Rome. She stood silent and motionless in her finest stola while her father and her future husband, Marcus Antonius Creticus, negotiated the final terms of what was essentially a business transaction disguised as a marriage agreement. The discussions had nothing to do with love, compatibility, or her happiness. Instead, the two men debated the precise value of her dowry. the inheritance rights of future children, and the political obligations that would bind their families together. Livia herself was not consulted about any aspect of the arrangement that would determine the rest of her life. The girl brings a dowry of 200,000 denarii, plus properties in Campania and a villa nearby. Her father recited from a prepared scroll. In return, she will receive the protection of your family name and a household appropriate to her station. Should she fail to produce male heirs within 5 years, the marriage may be dissolved at your discretion. The casual mention of divorce as a consequence of failing to bear sons sent a chill through Livia's body. She was being given a 5-year deadline to prove her worth as a breeding vessel, with the threat of abandonment hanging over her if she failed to perform her reproductive duties successfully. The pressure to conceive quickly and repeatedly would define her entire married life. Marcus Antonius Creticus was 35 years old, twice her age, with the scarred hands and weathered face of a career soldier who had spent decades commanding legions in distant provinces. During their brief courtship meetings, he had been polite but distant, evaluating her with the same dispassionate calculation he might use to assess a new horse or a piece of military equipment. She was clearly nothing more to him than a necessary acquisition for advancing his political career and continuing his family line. The girl seemed suitable, he had told her father after their first formal meeting. She's attractive enough to reflect well on my household, appears to be in good health for childbearing, and has been properly trained in domestic management. I am satisfied with the arrangement. Being described as suitable for marriage in the same tone one might use to discuss livestock was humiliating, but Livia was learning that aristocratic Roman marriages were not about personal feelings. They were strategic alliances designed to consolidate wealth, advance political careers, and produce legitimate heirs to inherit family properties and social positions. The wedding ceremony itself was scheduled for the following month, but Livia quickly discovered that the betrothal had already fundamentally changed her legal status and daily reality. She was no longer technically a member of her father's household. She now belonged to Marcus, even though they would not live together until after the formal ceremony. This meant that her future husband now had legal authority over her movements, her activities, and even her personal relationships. You will not leave the villa without written permission from Marcus, her father informed her the day after the betrothal. You will not speak privately with any man except members of your immediate family. You will not read any books or attend any entertainments that have not been approved by your future husband. These restrictions are necessary to preserve your reputation and ensure that you enter marriage without any behavior that might displease your new family. The imprisonment was now complete. What little freedom she had enjoyed as an unmarried daughter had been replaced by even more stringent controls designed to ensure that she would be delivered to her husband as an unblemished piece of property. She was no longer Livia. She was Marcus's future wife, defined entirely by her relationship to a man she barely knew and did not love. The month between betrothal and wedding was filled with intensive training in what her mother called wifely duties. This education covered everything from household management and child-rearing to the more intimate aspects of marriage that no one discussed directly, but which were clearly central to her future role. A patrician wife must understand that her husband's desires take precedence over her own comfort. Her mother explained during one of their private conversations. Roman men have needs that must be satisfied regularly and without complaint. Your happiness in marriage will depend largely on your willingness to please your husband in all things, regardless of your personal preferences. The euphemistic language could not disguise the reality of what was being described. Livia was being prepared for a life of sexual servitude to a man who would have absolute legal right to her body whenever and however he chose to claim it. Roman law gave husbands complete authority over their wives' sexual availability, and refusal or resistance could be punished as legal disobedience. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of her pre-wedding education was learning about the other women who would share her husband's attention. Marcus, like all wealthy Roman men, maintained a household that included female slaves who served as concubines, and he would continue to visit professional prostitutes and pursue affairs with other married women. Not only was she expected to tolerate these arrangements, she was required to manage the household slaves who might become her sexual rivals. Jealousy is an unbecoming emotion in a patrician wife, her mother warned. You must learn to view your husband's other relationships as practical arrangements that do not diminish your position as his legal wife and the mother of his legitimate children. The slave women who serve as physical needs are simply part of the household property that you will be expected to manage efficiently. As her wedding day approached, Livia realized that she was not preparing for marriage in any meaningful sense. She was preparing for a life of elegant slavery, where her beauty, her body, and her reproductive capacity would be used to advance the interests of a man and a family who viewed her as a valuable but ultimately disposable asset. The golden cage was about to close forever, and she was powerless to prevent it. Livia's wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp autumn air that made the marble statues in the villa's garden seem to shiver in the early morning light. She had barely slept the night before, her mind churning with anxiety about what the day would bring and what her life would become once the ceremony was complete. By sunrise, the villa was bustling with activity as dozens of slaves prepared for the elaborate celebration that would mark her transition from daughter to wife. The preparation ritual began before dawn, with female slaves bathing her in water scented with rose petals and anointing her skin with oils imported from distant provinces. Her hair was arranged in the traditional style for Roman brides, 6 separate braids wound with ribbons and crowned with a wreath of orange blossoms. The wedding stola was made of finest silk, dyed saffron yellow, and decorated with intricate embroidery that had taken months to complete. "You look beautiful, my daughter," her mother said as they made the final adjustments to her costume. "Marcus will be pleased with his acquisition, and you will bring honor to both our families through this union." The language of acquisition was telling. Even on her wedding day, Livia was reminded that she was property being transferred from one owner to another. The ceremony would not celebrate her happiness or her future, but rather the successful completion of a business transaction that would benefit everyone except the bride herself. The wedding itself was an elaborate public performance designed to demonstrate the wealth and political connections of both families. Hundreds of guests filled the villa's atrium and gardens, including senators, military commanders, and other members of Rome's elite social circle. Livia stood beside Marcus throughout the ceremony, smiling graciously and accepting congratulations, while internally feeling as though she was attending her own funeral. Marcus looked resplendent in his finest toga, his graying hair crowned with a wreath of bay leaves that emphasized his military achievements. He was handsome in the weathered way of career soldiers, but his eyes remained cold and calculating even during the ceremony's most emotional moments. When he spoke his vows, promising to protect and provide for his new wife, his tone was that of a man reading from a contract rather than declaring his love. The feast that followed the ceremony was lavish even by patrician standards, with tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies from across the empire. Guests toasted the couple's future happiness. Political allies made speeches about the benefits of uniting their families, and everyone celebrated the successful arrangement of what was clearly considered an advantageous marriage for all parties involved. But as the evening progressed and the guests became increasingly intoxicated, the conversations grew more explicit about what everyone knew would happen once the formal festivities ended. Roman wedding celebrations traditionally concluded with ribald jokes about the groom's sexual prowess and the bride's upcoming loss of virginity. But these comments took on a more sinister tone when directed at a 12-year-old girl who was about to be taken to bed by a man old enough to be her father. "Make sure you're gentle with her, Marcus," one elderly senator called out during the later stages of the feast. "She's still very young, and you'll want her healthy enough to bear you many sons." The laughter that followed this comment was loud and prolonged, but Livia noticed that none of the women present joined in. The older patrician wives looked uncomfortable, their expressions suggesting that they remembered their own wedding nights all too clearly and understood exactly what she was about to endure, as tradition demanded. The wedding guests eventually formed a procession to escort the bride to her new husband's house. Livia was carried through the streets of Rome in a decorated litter, surrounded by torch-bearing slaves and serenaded by musicians, while crowds of ordinary citizens gathered to watch the spectacle of aristocratic celebration. To the observers, she probably looked like the most fortunate girl in the empire. Beautiful, wealthy, married to a powerful man, surrounded by luxury that most Romans could never imagine. But Livia felt like a condemned prisoner being led to execution. Each step toward Marcus's villa brought her closer to a life of sexual subjugation, reproductive slavery, and complete loss of personal autonomy. The cheering crowds, the festive music, and the elaborate decorations could not disguise the reality that her childhood was ending and her imprisonment was beginning. That Marcus's villa was even more magnificent than her father's, with gardens that stretched for acres and rooms filled with treasures looted from military campaigns across the empire. But as the wedding guests finally departed and the slaves withdrew to their quarters, the grandeur of her new surroundings could not distract from the terrifying reality of what was about to happen. "Come," Marcus said simply, taking her hand and leading her toward the bedroom that would be the scene of her sexual initiation. His grip was firm but not painful, and his voice was matter-of-fact rather than passionate. This was clearly just another duty to be performed, another aspect of the marriage contract to be fulfilled. The bedroom was dimly lit by oil lamps and decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from mythology: gods pursuing mortal women, nymphs fleeing from satyrs, images of desire and conquest that suddenly seemed more ominous than romantic. The bed itself was enormous, covered with silk sheets and surrounded by furniture that spoke of wealth and power. What happened next was painful, frightening, and mercifully brief. Marcus approached his husbandly duties with the same efficient professionalism he brought to military campaigns. There was no cruelty, but there was also no tenderness, no consideration for her fear or pain, no acknowledgement that she was anything more than a vessel for his pleasure and a potential source of future heirs. When it was over, he rolled away from her and was asleep within minutes, leaving Livia alone with her thoughts and her newly awakened understanding of what her married life would entail. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the physical and emotional trauma of her sexual initiation while listening to her husband's steady breathing beside her. She was now officially a Roman wife, with all the duties and restrictions that role entailed. Her body belonged to Marcus. Her future depended on her ability to bear his children, and her happiness was irrelevant to everyone except herself. The golden cage had closed, and there would be no escape. The months following her wedding revealed the full extent of what it meant to be a patrician wife in ancient Rome. Livia's daily existence was regulated by rules and expectations that governed everything from how she dressed to whom she could speak, where she could go, and what she was allowed to think about. The villa that had seemed so magnificent during her wedding night quickly became another prison, more luxurious than her father's house, but equally restrictive. Her days began before dawn with personal hygiene rituals that were elaborate performances rather than private activities. Female slaves would bathe her, dress her hair, apply cosmetics, and select her clothing based on the day's scheduled activities and her husband's preferences. Every aspect of her appearance was calculated to reflect well on Marcus's status and wealth, while maintaining the modest demeanor that Roman society demanded from respectable wives. "The master prefers you in blue today," her personal slave, a young Greek woman named Helena, would announce each morning. "He has invited Senator Pompey for dinner, and blue is said to be the senator's favorite color on women." Even her clothing was chosen to please other men rather than herself. Marcus treated her like a decorative object to be displayed for the admiration of his political allies, and her own preferences about her appearance were completely irrelevant. She was expected to make herself as attractive as possible, while never appearing to enjoy her own beauty or to seek attention from anyone other than her husband. The household itself was a complex social hierarchy where Livia occupied a strange position. Legally, she was second only to Marcus in authority over the villa's dozens of slaves and freedmen. But practically, her power was limited to domestic matters and could be overruled by her husband at any time. She could order the preparation of meals, arrange the cleaning schedules, and manage the female slaves, but she could not purchase anything significant, could not hire or dismiss servants, and could not make any decisions that affected the household's finances or operations. More disturbingly, she was expected to manage the female slaves who served as Marcus's concubines. Roman society accepted that married men would have sexual relationships with their household slaves, and wives were expected not only to tolerate these arrangements, but to ensure they operated smoothly. This meant selecting the most attractive slave women for her husband's pleasure, providing them with appropriate clothing and cosmetics, and scheduling their availability to suit his desires. "The master has expressed interest in the new Gallic girl," Helena informed her one morning as they reviewed the household accounts. "She should be prepared for his visit tonight, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in the silk stola he prefers for such occasions." The casual discussion of arranging sexual encounters between her husband and other women was devastating, but Livia learned that displaying jealousy or distress would only bring punishment. Roman wives who objected to their husband's extramarital activities were considered unreasonable and could be divorced for failing to fulfill their wifely duties properly. But perhaps the most suffocating aspect of her new life was the constant surveillance. Every conversation was monitored by slaves who reported to Marcus. Every activity was observed and evaluated. Every friendship was scrutinized for its political implications. She could not receive visitors without permission, could not send letters without having them read first, and could not leave the villa without an elaborate escort that ensured she was never truly alone. "Where would you like to go today, mistress?" Her bodyguard, a former gladiator named Brutus, would ask when she expressed a desire to visit the markets or temples. "The master has instructed me to accompany you wherever you travel and to ensure that you speak only with appropriate persons." The appropriate persons were a carefully selected group of other patrician wives whose husbands were political allies of Marcus. These women became her only social contacts outside the household, but their conversations were limited to safe topics like fashion, household management, and child-rearing. Any discussion of politics, philosophy, or literature was discouraged as inappropriate for feminine minds. Even her relationship with her own family had been fundamentally altered by marriage. She could visit her father's house only with Marcus's permission and always under supervision. Her correspondence with her mother was read before being delivered, and her younger brother was instructed to avoid private conversations with her that might interfere with her loyalty to her new family. The isolation was psychological as well as physical. Roman society provided no role models for women who might want something more than marriage and motherhood. The literature she was allowed to read consisted mainly of romantic poetry that glorified feminine submission and domestic virtues. The religious ceremonies she attended emphasized women's roles as wives and mothers rather than as individuals with their own spiritual needs. The golden cage had closed, and there would be no escape. The months following her wedding revealed the full extent of what it meant to be a patrician wife in ancient Rome. Livia's daily existence was regulated by rules and expectations that governed everything from how she dressed to whom she could speak, where she could go, and what she was allowed to think about. The villa that had seemed so magnificent during her wedding night quickly became another prison, more luxurious than her father's house, but equally restrictive. Her days began before dawn with personal hygiene rituals that were elaborate performances rather than private activities. Female slaves would bathe her, dress her hair, apply cosmetics, and select her clothing based on the day's scheduled activities and her husband's preferences. Every aspect of her appearance was calculated to reflect well on Marcus's status and wealth, while maintaining the modest demeanor that Roman society demanded from respectable wives. "The master prefers you in blue today," her personal slave, a young Greek woman named Helena, would announce each morning. "He has invited Senator Pompey for dinner, and blue is said to be the senator's favorite color on women." Even her clothing was chosen to please other men rather than herself. Marcus treated her like a decorative object to be displayed for the admiration of his political allies, and her own preferences about her appearance were completely irrelevant. She was expected to make herself as attractive as possible while never appearing to enjoy her own beauty or to seek attention from anyone other than her husband. The household itself was a complex social hierarchy where Livia occupied a strange position. Legally, she was second only to Marcus in authority over the villa's dozens of slaves and freedmen. But practically, her power was limited to domestic matters and could be overruled by her husband at any time. She could order the preparation of meals, arrange the cleaning schedules, and manage the female slaves, but she could not purchase anything significant, could not hire or dismiss servants, and could not make any decisions that affected the household's finances or operations. More disturbingly, she was expected to manage the female slaves who served as Marcus's concubines. Roman society accepted that married men would have sexual relationships with their household slaves, and wives were expected not only to tolerate these arrangements, but to ensure they operated smoothly. This meant selecting the most attractive slave women for her husband's pleasure, providing them with appropriate clothing and cosmetics, and scheduling their availability to suit his desires. "The master has expressed interest in the new Gallic girl," Helena informed her one morning as they reviewed the household accounts. "She should be prepared for his visit tonight, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in the silk stola he prefers for such occasions." The casual discussion of arranging sexual encounters between her husband and other women was devastating, but Livia learned that displaying jealousy or distress would only bring punishment. Roman wives who objected to their husband's extramarital activities were considered unreasonable and could be divorced for failing to fulfill their wifely duties properly. But perhaps the most suffocating aspect of her new life was the constant surveillance. Every conversation was monitored by slaves who reported to Marcus. Every activity was observed and evaluated. Every friendship was scrutinized for its political implications. She could not receive visitors without permission, could not send letters without having them read first, and could not leave the villa without an elaborate escort that ensured she was never truly alone. "Where would you like to go today, mistress?" Her bodyguard, a former gladiator named Brutus, would ask when she expressed a desire to visit the markets or temples. The master has instructed me to accompany you wherever you travel and to ensure that you speak only with appropriate persons. The appropriate persons were a carefully selected group of other patrician wives whose husbands were political allies of Marcus. These women became her only social contacts outside the household, but their conversations were limited to safe topics like fashion, household management, and child-rearing. Any discussion of politics, philosophy, or literature was discouraged as inappropriate for feminine minds. Even her relationship with her own family had been fundamentally altered by marriage. She could visit her father's house only with Marcus's permission and always under supervision. Her correspondence with her mother was read before being delivered, and her younger brother was instructed to avoid private conversations with her that might interfere with her loyalty to her new family. The isolation was psychological as well as physical. Roman society provided no role models for women who might want something more than marriage and motherhood. The literature she was allowed to read consisted mainly of romantic poetry that glorified feminine submission and domestic virtues. The religious ceremonies she attended emphasized women's roles as wives and mothers rather than as individuals with their own spiritual needs.